If we're going to talk about Islamic philosophy, we first have to talk about the history of Islam. Islam begins around the year 610 in the city of Mecca in the southern portion of the Arabian Peninsula, when a rich merchant named Muhammad believes he's been visited by the archangel Gabriel. Gabriel tells Muhammad that he is to restore the original, strictly monotheistic faith of Abraham. If you remember, Abraham has two sons. The younger son, Isaac, born of Abraham's wife Sarah, from whom the Jews descend, and Ishmael, born of Abraham's handmaid Hagar, from whom the Arabs descend. Hagar and Ishmael are driven out in the desert to die by a jealous Sarah. And there, the Muslims, the Arabs, believe that God preserves Ishmael's life. Well, that's the religion that Muhammad is to restore. It's a very simple religion. There are 5 pillars, 5 basic sets of beliefs. Number one, to acknowledge publicly that there is a single God, Allah. Allah simply is the Arabic word for the God, and to acknowledge at the same time that Muhammad is the prophet of this God. Number 2, to pray 5 times a day. Number 3, to give alms to the poor. Number 4, to fast during the month of Ramadan. And number 5, if you can, to visit the city of Mecca, where everything begins. Fairly simple faith, easy to follow, and as a consequence, by the time Muhammad dies about 20 years later, in the year 632, much of southern Arabia, from Mecca to the much larger city of Medina, about 60 miles away, has converted to Islam. In the subsequent century, that's what one historian has called the explosion, quote unquote, of Islam into the world. By 636, Islam has conquered, Muslims riding out of the desert have conquered the city of Damascus. By 637, Jerusalem. And by 646, Egypt, the very wealthy region. By 700, within a century, by the year 700, Muslims have conquered all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. At the same time, going eastward, they've conquered Persia, they've pushed the Byzantines back up into the mountains of Anatolia, and have reached the banks of the Indus River in northern India. In 711, a group of Muslim raiders have crossed the Straits of Gibraltar into southern Spain. And by 732, exactly a century after the death of Muhammad, they have gotten to within 90 miles of the city of Paris. And there, in 732, at the Battle of Tours, sometimes called the Battle of Poitiers, Charles Martel, the grandson of the Frankish king Charlemagne, has stopped them. So that represents, within a century of the death of Muhammad, that represents the high watermark of political Islam in the West. It's an enormous empire. It stretches from the Atlantic all the way to India and is pushing up into Central Asia via Afghanistan all the way up into present-day Uzbekistan. So an enormous political entity. And what's interesting about this is that Muhammad is a merchant. He's not a poor carpenter like Jesus. By the way, Jesus is not the Son of God to Muslims, but he is a very, very important prophet. In fact, Mary, the mother of Jesus, has an entire chapter, an entire surah in Arabic, in the Quran. So unlike Jesus, who expresses a great deal of skepticism for money, a great deal of skepticism for wealth, Muhammad is born as a poor boy who rises to great wealth. He marries the boss's widow, a woman named Khadija, and thereafter acquires a great deal of extra cash. And so Islam is a system that does not scorn money. Right? Remember, Jesus has a tendency to get kind of mad or at least somewhat censorious at people who have a little bit too much respect for cash. So Muhammad is a merchant, and this is reflected in this system that is established to kind of govern Islam. Number one, there are no taxes on Muslim. Number two, Muslims are encouraged to travel. If you remember, heading off to Mecca. Number 3, the Muslims established a very good system of coinage. Right? It's a very much a free enterprise zone. And I'm telling you this because what happens is, by the time we get to about 750, Islam is beginning to roll in it. It's a very, very wealthy system. In fact, by 755, when there's the conclusion of a major rebellion that transfers the capital of Islam from Damascus over to the newfound city of Baghdad in present-day Iraq on the banks of the Tigris River. And the Baghdad in 750 as a planned city. I'm holding my hands into concentric rings. The central ring on the banks of the Tigris is where the Grand Mosque and the palace of the ruler, known as the caliph. The caliph is not a king. A caliph is a title that embodies both religious authority and secular authority. And in that first ring are where the rich and powerful live. In the second ring are the middle class, and the outer rings are the poorest of the poor. But this planned city becomes one of the largest and most prosperous cities in the world. Muslims are traveling from as far away as China. There's a Muslim cemetery in Beijing that dates from the early 700s all the way out to Spain, right? And there are Muslims in places like Toledo and in North Africa and in Egypt and across this great span. And one of the tenets of Islam, at least one of the secondary tenets of Islam, is that you should learn Arabic, because Arabic is the language that is revealed, that the revelation, the Quran, is revealed to Muhammad in. And so all of these people who are converts, who are converting to Islam, be they from Iberia or Morocco, or whether they're from southern Anatolia in the region of Turkey, or Damascus, a Greek-speaking region, primarily Greek and Aramaic, or all the way out in Central Asia, as these people convert, they learn as their secondary language Arabic. And they share this commonality of religion. Their culture might be quite different, but the religion is the same. And they have this universal language. So what I'm describing here in Baghdad is why Baghdad becomes, by the time we get to the year 800, which is our next big marker, why Baghdad becomes perhaps the most populous and certainly probably the richest city in the world, because it sits at the juncture of these major trade routes. And Islam, which has started as a small desert religion, Islam has succeeded in a very short time in conquering much of the known world. Not quite Italy. They didn't succeed in conquering France, but they still hold Spain, and they hold all of North Africa. And the wealth that travels back and forth, remember, Muhammad's a merchant, this wealth that travels back and forth begins to accumulate at the center of this empire in Baghdad. So I bring up Baghdad because it is the great capital. It is the most important city of the 9th century, of the 800s. And I bring it up because the system that's established there is a system that favors, to some extent, at the top of that system, meaning in those levels, those upper class levels in the center ring of Baghdad, those upper class levels have a high degree of reverence for learning. I'm a medievalist by training, and so sometimes I'll bring out a fact, almost always I'll bring out this fact when we talk about knowledge in the Christian world. In the year 900, the largest library in Europe, in Western Christian Europe, was in the monastery at a place called Fulda. And Fulda is in present-day Germany. And that monastery in the year 900 took an accounting of their books. The librarian, whose name was Regobert, a good Germanic name, Regobert was so proud of this, he said at the beginning of his accounting, we have almost too many books to count. We have 524 books in our library. The largest library in Western Europe in the year 900 had 500 books. By comparison, over there in Cordoba, in the Muslim part of Spain, the ruler in Cordoba has a personal library, we're told, of 500,000 books. So even if he's exaggerating by a factor of 10, that's still 50,000 books, right? So you begin to see the kind of disparity in intellectual achievement between Islam and Christianity in the period before the year 1200, 1300, really before about 1250. And the reason for this disparity is, one, Christians are terribly, terribly impoverished, and two, Muslims are terribly, terribly wealthy, at least the upper class is wealthy. And wealth and education go hand in hand. The reason we can have young 18 to 22-year-olds sitting in a class listening to someone talk about ancient history, or at least medieval history, is because we Americans and Western world is so phenomenally wealthy that we don't need you out there working. And the same dynamic plays out in Baghdad in the 7 and 800s, that the sons of these wealthy merchants, many of them are off, camel racing or buying fancy horses or, drinking wine, a very forbidden thing, chasing girls, all of these fun things. But a few of those rich merchant boys are entranced by learning. And a few of them have dedicated their lives to study. This is actually a really interesting side topic, and if we had more time, I'd talk about the growth of intellectual history in Islam and about how things like the study of language, how we have enormous biographies of early scholars, and how we have books that are dedicated to things like grammar, semiotics, the study of signs and languages. There's all kinds of fairly advanced study in Islam in the 7, 8, and 900s. But I want to focus instead on a phenomenon that begins around the year 800, when the Caliph, the ruler of Baghdad, the prince of the faithful, the Amir al-Mu'mineen in Arabic, when he becomes a great patron of learning. And he establishes what some people sometimes call the first university. Now, a university is an Islamic invention. The first universities in the world the oldest universities in the world are Al-Azhar in Cairo, founded in the 900s, and Kairouan in present-day Morocco, founded in the late 800s. These predate Christian universities by a good 2 centuries. In fact, Christian universities are founded under the influence of ideas that come from the Muslim world. But the first university was something that was called the Beit al-Hikmah, and that word means Beit, the house, Hikmah, wisdom, the house of wisdom, the house of knowledge, which is sometimes called a library, but sometimes a research institution, but I think it might best be thought of as a kind of high-level university. The founder of this is a guy named Harun al-Rashid. Harun al-Rashid is the caliph, the ruler in Baghdad around the year 800. You've probably actually heard of Harun al-Rashid. You don't know you've heard of him, but you probably had. If you've ever heard a story from the 1001 Nights, like Sinbad or Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, right? Sinbad, the caliph, the ruler, who's often referenced in those stories, not the evil one killing young girls, but the good ruler who Scheherazade refers to is Harun al-Rashid. He's widely considered, well, the name Rashid, Harun is Aaron, the name Aaron, Rashid means righteous in Arabic. So Aaron the righteous, Harun al-Rashid, is a patron of knowledge. He gives money in Baghdad to the establishment of something like a research library, the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Learning. And what goes on there is a translation project from older languages into Arabic. The early Arabs the Arabs at the time of Muhammad are not a group of people who have a great deal of scholarly accomplishments. They're very good at riding camels, they're very good at raiders, they're very good long-distance traders, but they're not, for the most part, scholars. But now that they've gotten wealthy, and now that they've begun to absorb around them other people who have scholarly traditions, such as the Persians who convert to Islam, and many of the Greeks in Damascus who are converting to Islam, they bring with them older scholarly traditions. And so what's going on at the Beit al-Hikmah is the translation of things like, Greek texts, Persian texts, a few Sanskrit texts, things from North India, the Hindus, right? In fact, if we were to talk about some of the mathematical accomplishments at the Beit al-Hikmah, we would talk about things like Arabic numerals. Well, Arabic numerals are actually invented, the decimal system is invented in India. They're Sanskrit numbers. The Arabs pick them up and adapt them. The one thing that's added by the Arabs is the number 0, the idea of 0. In fact, the word 0 comes from an Arabic word, as does the word sifr. Sifr, that's the Arabic word. 0 or cipher in English. So these are what is coming in there. Things from Chinese, things from Sanskrit, things from Persian, but things from Greek. And what we're finding around the year 800 is we're finding that they are translating, above all else, they begin the translation of Greek philosophy. And as you start to translate Greek philosophy, right, and this is something interesting about ancient Greek philosophy. Every time your culture discovers, or a culture discovers ancient Greek, there's an intellectual blossoming. There's a kind of, you discover Plato and you discover the philosopher, Aristotle, and your culture takes off intellectually. And so around the year 800, there at the Beit al-Hikmah, under the patronage of Harun al-Rashid, the Arab philosophers begin to emerge. We begin to see the first of the Arab philosophers. And this represents an intellectual flowering that begins to take off starting in Baghdad and spreading outward in the Muslim world. Right? So what does it mean to rediscover the Greeks? Well, what it means to rediscover the Greeks, number one, is you rediscover Aristotle. And Aristotle, above all else, gives you these tools of reasoning. The syllogism, syllogistic thinking, right? Tools for categorizing. There's all kinds of fun things that come along when Aristotle is rediscovered. And our Muslim philosophers begin to emerge. I've sent Dr. Clanton a little handout there about the major early Muslim philosophers. Brief descriptions, right? And you'll notice at the top, right, there's El-Kindi, the first of them, El-Farabi, right? The greatest of them, Avicenna, otherwise known as Ibn Sina, and then Al-Ghazali, the last of them, the kind of the most important at the tail end to kind of end the process. You'll notice it's about a 200-year span there, about a 200-year span beginning roughly in the 150-year span, about 850, and culminating around the year 1100, during which Greek philosophy is actively pursued and developed and so on and so forth. By the way, I forgot to mention, one reason why the bookshelves, you see my bookshelves behind me, one reason why the bookshelves are so full in Islam is because Muslims have paper. Christians are writing primarily on something called parchment, which is highly refined leather. It's great. If you see medieval Christian documents, they're amazingly well preserved. But paper, which comes from China, notice how we're picking up things at distant places and bringing them back. So as paper comes into the Muslim world, it drops the cost of books. And with a little ink and a little knowledge of writing, I'm writing from right to left here, a little knowledge of writing, you can begin a system which books are cranked out at enormous rates. Literally, it's not merely that we're reviving the Greek philosophy, it's that everyone who's interested in ancient Greek philosophy, which thanks to the Beit al-Hikmah are now appearing in good Arabic, everyone who's interested in this can now write their own little book on it. And this is what we're talking about. You have the names in front of you of the four major, hundreds of minor philosophers. You'll notice on that sheet also at the very top, I put the phrase, what does Athens have to do with Mecca? And the reason I've put that on the front, what does Athens have to do with Mecca? Because this becomes the central question. It's a little play. I'll explain in a second. It's the central question of the Middle Ages. It's the central question of the Middle Ages for all three monotheistic faiths: Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. It's a little play. Notice I said that it's a little joke because it's originally a question. The original question is, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? It's a question answered by the early Christian, early Catholic thinker Tertullian, by the early Catholic thinker Tertullian. And what it means is, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem, or in our case, what does Athens have to do with Mecca? The question is, what does philosophy have to do with religion? Right? And this is the problem that's presented. This is the problem that's presented to our Muslim thinkers. The problem that's presented to our Muslim thinkers there in the 800s is, I've learned Aristotle, and Aristotle has given me these tools that have given me human reason, have allowed me to use reason to the fullest that we can. And now I begin to approach our central text of religion, in this case the Quran, right, the book that results from the revelations given to Muhammad. And as I approach this, how can I use philosophy on divine revelation? And Tertullian and other Christians answer this: you don't need philosophy to answer the divine revelation, and others will say you do. In fact, one of the things that's interesting to me is, and I've sometimes called this the two paths or the three paths, depending on how we approach it, meaning that what's going to happen is this becomes the question that obsesses medieval philosophers. What does philosophy have to do with religion? And there are three answers. There are three, I'm trying to hold up three fingers here for you, three answers that come out of this. And the first answer is the answer that Tertullian reached, which is that nothing, that philosophy has nothing to do with divine revelation. The Quran, if you're a Muslim, the Quran is sufficient in itself. You just do what it says. It's the word of God. See, one thing about the Quran is different than the Bible. The Bible is divinely inspired. Humans write the Bible under God's direction. But the Quran is the actual word of God. It is right when Muhammad is receiving a revelation, his aspect seems to change, and he speaks, and when he speaks with a different voice, and that words that come out at that moment are actually the voice, the words of God. So the Quran is actually God speaking. And so you can see why something like reason might be very problematic for those scholars who believe you don't need it, because everything is sufficiently contained. Everything you need to do is in the Quran itself. So the first solution is you don't need reason. You don't need philosophy. And as we look at our list of philosophers, our Muslim philosophers, they're ones who are going to argue a different one. So our three ways of approaching this question, what does Athens have to do with Mecca? The first is nothing at all. All right, this is simply not the case. The second is the one, as you would imagine, the second is the one which says you can use reason. I'm sure Professor Clanton agrees with us. You can use reason to sustain, to prove, to support divine revelation, to support the Word of God. And this is the one that we see with Al-Kindi and Al-Farabi, culminating with probably the greatest of the Muslim philosophers, a guy named Ibn Sina, or Avicenna. And Avicenna is the greatest of the Muslim philosophers because he's the most strict Aristotelian. He's the one who advances Aristotle the farthest during his lifetime. You need to know a little bit about Avicenna. He's famous in the West because he's a translator, an interpreter of Aristotle, an Aristotelian, but he's also one of the most important medical doctors in the history of the world. He goes into a medical career, and for a long time, medicine and philosophy run in parallel. Doctors and philosophers often are an overlapping profession. And if you think about it, modern doctors don't have a lot of free time. They're very, very busy people. But in the past, there was not a lot doctors could do except sit by the bedside and wait for nature to take its course in that patient, either live or die. And so typically doctors had a lot of free time to read and think about philosophy. So Avicenna takes up medicine at a very young age, and by the time he's 17, he says, he writes an autobiography later on, a very, very rare thing for anyone to write an autobiography. But he writes an autobiography, and he says, by the age of 17, I knew everything there was to know about medicine, which is quite a brag. But in fact, at the age of 17, he's hired by the local prince to be his personal physician. And the prince gives him enough money to establish a medical school, a hospital, and he goes on to write a very important book called the Kanun fi Tib, which is the laws of medicine, in which he lays out various ailments and the treatments and so on and so forth. So he's quite famous as a medical doctor. And in fact, his book, the Kanun fi Tib, is in translation in Latin, is the standard text in European medical schools until the 1750s. So his credentials as an intellectual are quite impressive. But he comes to the conclusion that one can prove the existence of God using human reason, which is that second solution. The first solution to the question, what does Athens have to do with Mecca? What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? The first solution is nothing. The first solution is divine revelation. You don't need high-level Aristotelian reasoning to prove it. But the second, and this is the one that starts there at the Beit el-Hikmah in the 800s. The second is you can use reason You can use reason to improve our understanding of revelation. And this proves to be incredibly influential. Incredibly influential. And so it's so influential that it affects not merely Muslim thinkers, it also affects Jewish and eventually Christian thinkers. So if we were to talk about our story, right, if we talk about our history of Islam, we talk about our history of Islamic philosophy, we also need to talk about a little bit about the treatment of minorities in Islam. See, as Islam expands out into the world, Islam, Muhammad's followers, those followers who are riding under the banner of Islam and conquering the world, are not people who forcibly convert others. Right? The Quran has a very famous passage that says there's no coercion in religion, which means that if you conquer, by the way, that doesn't apply to pagans. If you get a pagan, you can force a pagan to convert, but you can't force a person who's a monotheist. You can't force a Christian or a Jew or even a Zoroastrian, if you know what that is. You can't force them to convert because they have received a prior revelation, a revelation that's been superseded by the Quranic revelation of Muhammad. So Christians got the message, they kind of got away from it. Jews got the message, they got away from it. So you should try to bring them back through persuasion, not through force. And the result of this is that Jews and Christians are allowed to live peacefully within the Muslim world, within the Muslim polity. You got to pay a special tax. You can't try to convert people. You're kind of a second-class citizen. But the good news is nobody's trying to kill you. The good news is you're free to be a Jew, you're free to be a Muslim, and in some places you can rise fairly high. You can get wealthy. Being a merchant is fine as long as you pay your taxes. So, in fact, for some Christian communities, for example, the Coptic Christians of Egypt, of whom there may or may not be some in this class, there's many Coptic Christians from Egypt whose parents are from Egypt here at Lipscomb. Coptic Christians were seen as heretics by the Greek Byzantines and were persecuted. But when the Muslims came in, they allowed the Copts to practice their religion. And so Copts, for the most part, were more prosperous and, in some respects, perhaps more happy living under Islamic rule, at least initially, than they were under Byzantine Christian rule, because they were not being persecuted as heretics. Well, within this context of Greeks, of Christians and Jews living under Islam, it's probably the Jews and a few Christians who begin to revive this Islamic way of thinking, right? Begin to revive this ancient Greek philosophic way of thinking. And we find that there are many famous Jewish and, after a while, a few Christian thinkers who are following this same path, saying, yes, Athens has a lot to do with Jerusalem. Athens has a lot to do with Jerusalem. The Aristotelian tools, the tools of Aristotle, are appropriate when applied to religious belief. And this begins to spread to the Muslim world. Let's fast forward a little bit. So we've gone from 800, let's skip forward a little bit to the year 1000. Because the year 1000 marks a shift in the fortunes of Western Europe. If we were to talk about European history, we would talk about the fall of Rome, the Dark Ages, what we historians more rightly refer to as the Low Middle Ages, which Christianity is quite impoverished. And then around the year 1000, give or take, there begins to be a shift, and we enter something called the High Middle Ages, where the prospects of Europe begin to look up. And the prospects of Europe looking up means a great deal more wealth, a great deal more military capability, and a great deal more stability politically. The 900s are a very important period because the Europeans kind of figure out things like how do we maintain a kingship? How do we avoid civil war when the king dies? How do you avoid his sons trying to kill each other? And the answer to that is something called primogeniture, where the oldest son always inherits, which seems like a very simple thing to do, but it solves the problem of fratricidal wars. And now Europe has, right, fairly predictable succession from king to prince, prince to prince, king to prince, right? So that solves that problem. And then by the year 1000, Christianity is on the rise in Western Europe, but meaning the Christian kingdoms are becoming more powerful. And in Spain, around the year 1010, the Muslims in the south, well, they get the civil war. And that civil war blows it up, and that allows the Christians in the north to gain control. Right. So the one thing that the Christians excel at, see, Muslims are the masters of the intellectual world prior to the year 1000. It is, you could look at the sciences, for example, mathematics, physics, astronomy, something like 25% of the stars that have names, not like a number, 25% of the stars that have names have Arabic names, Betelgeuse, Altair, Alrith. These are stars that have Arabic names because Arab astronomers, Muslim astronomers, are mapping the sky. Mathematics, the algorithm, the algebra, the concept of zero, these are all Arabic ideas. Physics, I've already described medicine. Avicenna is, one of the great medical geniuses of all time, in addition to being one of the great philosophers. And so the Christians who are impoverished, who are living in kind of a chaotic political situation, they get their act together. And the one thing they have going for them, the one thing that Muslims like them for and hate them for, is that man for man, Christian warriors are the best in the world. The mounted knight is terrifying to Muslims because they say he's as brave as a lion, as dumb as a dog. He's not very bright, but he fights like nobody's business. And there's a strong trade among Muslims, bringing in groups of knight to fight alongside them. So what you set up is a world where when the Christians start getting their act together, they begin to turn their military competency outward. And in the 1000s, literally the second half of the 1000s, Islam now begins to suffer a series of problems. The Christians begin to conquer places. The first place they conquer, starting in the 1060s, is Sicily, that island to the south of Italy. By the way, all the islands, prior to the reconquest of Sicily, all of the islands in the Mediterranean belongs to Muslims. So 1065 is when the Christians begin to conquer Sicily. And then in 1085, they conquer one of the great prizes, which in the central part of Spain is the city of Toledo, right? And Toledo, when they conquer Toledo in 1085, Alfonso VI, the king of Castile, when he conquers Toledo in 1085, it immediately becomes the largest city by population in Christian Europe. The largest, in the year 1000, the biggest cities in Europe are about 10 to 15,000 people. Rome has about 15,000. There's about 7,000 in Paris. In northern Spain, Leon has 4,000. There's 28 to 30,000 people in Toledo. And here's the thing, Toledo is full of libraries. Then in 1095 through 1095, the First Crusade gets going, and in 1099, Jerusalem falls to Christians. So now by the year 1000, within a half century, from 1065 to 1099, Christians have conquered three major outposts: Jerusalem, Sicily, and Toledo. And in each place, but especially in Toledo, books start popping up. Christians have very few books. About the only people who read and write in medieval, early, low medieval, low Middle Ages Christianity, but the only people who read and write are monks and nuns. Aristocrats, kings and dukes and counts don't read and write. And so what happens is all of these books in Toledo become a big draw. And lots of people start coming into Spain, into Toledo, to get at those libraries. And beginning around the year 1100, there's something like the Beit el-Hikmah informally. And this is a project to translate from Arabic into Latin. And the books begin to come out of Toledo in Latin. Some historians, a historian named Charles Homer Haskins, sometimes refers to something called the Renaissance of the 12th century, meaning Christians at the end of the 11th century have conquered the Muslim world. They've gotten some wealth going. They've got some places they can, Christian merchants can travel to Jerusalem now from northern Italy and so forth. And the books now are beginning to have an intellectual effect on Christian society. And so some of the things that are being translated, some of it's Greek, some of it's the stuff that was translated from Greek into Arabic and now is being translated from Arabic into Latin. But that's not the big prize. The big prize is, the commentaries that go with the Greek. So you'll have a thin volume of Aristotle, and bound with it will be four or five commentaries written by Muslim thinkers, translated into Latin that you, right, the monk, can now read. And so we start in the 12th century, the 1100s, there begins to be, right, what happens when you rediscover the Greeks, what happens when you rediscover the Greeks, or in this case, what happens when you rediscover the Greeks alongside some really sharp commentaries. What happens is you get an intellectual blossoming. This is why Haskin refers to the Renaissance of the 12th century. So by the 12th century, Christians have begun to follow in the footsteps of Muslims, in that they are beginning to use philosophy, the Aristotelian tools, to approach and understand their religion. And so, right, we had two paths. The one path is philosophy has nothing to do with revelation, nothing to do with religion. And the second path, which we've been exploring, which is that you can use philosophy to understand religion, to understand revelation. And in fact, this is something that Christians now, by the 12th century, the 1100s, have picked up from Muslims, primarily, right, through those translations that are coming out of Toledo. In fact, in Spain itself, even by the time we get to the 12th century, even before the 12th century, by the time we get there, there's a kind of blossoming of philosophy in Spain, in the Muslim part. It produces a couple of very important Aristotelian philosophers. On the Muslim side, there's a guy named Ibn Rushd, again, a doctor, who's better known to the West as Averroes. And Averroes is probably the most strictly Aristotelian of all the philosophers. Even more than Avicenna, he relies on Aristotle. And as a consequence, it's Averroes who's probably the most influential on the thinking of someone like Thomas Aquinas, the great Catholic thinker who at the University of Paris, notice how universities have finally arrived in Europe. There at the University of Paris, when Thomas Aquinas is working out his masterful Summa, right, it's under the influence of Aristotle, but it's under the influence of Aristotle as interpreted first by Avicenna and then really by Averroes, right? On the Jewish side, there's another great Aristotelian who applies that thinking to the Torah, and his name is Maimonides. And Maimonides writes a book on the Torah called A Guide for the Perplexed. And this will be an explanation of the Jewish version of monotheism to Jewish readers, written, of course, in Arabic, because, right, Jews and Christians living in the Muslim world have acclimated themselves to the standards of the dominant culture. Much like most Jews in the United States write not in Hebrew, but write in English, Jews in the south of Spain in the 1100s would be writing in Arabic, right? So Maimonides, known in Arabic as Ibn Musa, the son of Moses, Maimonides becomes the greatest medieval Jewish philosopher under the influence of, well, Avicenna and Aristotle. So we've been talking about these two paths, but there's a third path that appears in the Islamic world. In fact, the third path is the one that closes off the second path in Islam. And what I mean by closes off the second path is the thinking that emerges, that promotes the third path, ceases the study of philosophy, or greatly reduces the study of philosophy in the Islamic world. And this third path is the path of mysticism. Right, on your four philosophers of Baghdad, the fourth is a guy named Ibn Ghazali, or El-Ghazali. El-Ghazali is a great philosopher, a man who understands Aristotle, but after going down the path of philosophy for a while, and after following it very intently, he decides that it is fundamentally incorrect. He gives up everything, literally quits his job, quits the position from which he earns riches from the various authorities, and goes off and lives effectively as a beggar for a while. And when he returns, he writes a book that's called The Confusion, right? What's it called? Excuse me a second. I got to look at my notes for 2 seconds. He writes a book called The Incoherence of the Philosophers. Excuse me, I can't believe I forgot that. The Incoherence of the Philosophers, right? And so what the incoherence of the philosophers is it's a rejection of philosophy. And what replaces it is what we come to know with regard to the Muslim world as Sufism. And Sufism is a mystical practice. And again, right, Lipscomb's a good Church of Christ people, so we tend to neglect the mystical side of religion. But in this case, this is a belief that you can approach the divine directly. Through a series of practices. It's a long tradition in Islam. It may well come, some thinking says it may well come from Buddhism. And remember, Muslims are all the way out there in North India. They've gone up into Afghanistan. And those regions prior to the 7th century, the 8th century, are regions where Buddhism and other esoteric religions have long taken hold. It's not well studied. There's a lot of theories. I kind of like that theory, but it's not the only one. Be that as it may, starting probably in Persia, on the eastern side of the Muslim world, there grows a tradition by which, through intense prayer, through rigorous self-discipline, you can not merely understand revelation, you can approach the divine and seek union with God. And so our third path, the two paths, philosophy has nothing to do with revelation, therefore just study the Bible or the Quran, right? And the second path, you can use philosophy, human reason to do it. And here's the third path, go ask God yourself, right? And so the Sufi tradition, the tradition in Islam whereby individuals following a master engage in very intense prayer and practice, and by so doing, can approach God, can achieve a kind of union with the divine. And this tradition is a very lengthy tradition. It's a tradition that continues to the present day. There are Sufi masters and Sufi followers all over the Muslim world. And of course, if the other two traditions are affecting the other two monotheistic faith, right, the faith of Judaism and Christianity, so too will Muslim mysticism also affect the other two, right? In Spain, at the same time we have our great logical Aristotelian philosophers, there emerge, fairly close together, there emerge three mystics, one for each of the monotheistic faith. The most important and the earliest is a Spanish Sufi master named Ibn Arabi. And Ibn Arabi, he says things like, I'm the Sufi master. It's one of his famous poems. He writes mostly in poetry, right, as many Sufis do. He says, I'm the monk, I'm the rabbi, I'm the priest, I'm the imam, right? It's syncretic in that when you approach God directly in this way, Ibn Arabi seems to be arguing that the differences between the religions begin to disappear. Right? Funny things happen when you get into the mystical tradition, right? On the Jewish side, there's a guy named Ibn Ezra who supposedly ups one day and decides to walk to Jerusalem and dies. The story is that he dies as he steps over the door path into Jerusalem, because it's kind of the culmination of his life. So again, poets and mystics, and these mystical traditions are quite strong, right? It's a rejection of both. It's a rejection primarily of reason, or explicitly a rejection of reason, but to some extent also a rejection of revelation, that the revelation is the building block upon which, through this intense practice, you can approach the divine. For the Christians, there's a guy named Ramon Lull, a Catalan from the south of Spain, a Catalan named Ramon Lull, who learns Arabic, studies Ibn Arabi's poetry, studies his writings, and begins a kind of mystical practice. He's a fairly important figure in a kind of side branch of Catholic history. So this is the third path, and this third path is as durable as the other two paths. It has a very long history. We Protestants, assuming those of you are Protestants, but we Protestants tend to neglect the mystical side or reject the mystical side. We focus on the reason more than mysticism, but it's a strong and lengthy tradition. So when we talk about something like what's coming out of Baghdad, and we're talking about this spread of Baghdad, we're talking about some very powerful intellectual trends, some trends that are tagging along behind material things, right? First, we have to get our wealth, so we have people devote themselves to study, and then a kind of intellectual flowering on the basis of this material wealth. And as Christians, right, first Jews, of course, are tagging along primarily with the Muslims, but as Christians in the West begin to rise, as the wealth begins to stack up in Western Europe, it doesn't take a lot, right? But as it begins to stack up, as in the 900s, as the politics level off, as they get more stable, as they begin to nibble or take big bites of the Muslim world, and Christianity begins to rise in intellect, in wealth, and then on top of it, intellect. Universities need endowments, and these university endowments come from material advance. So what's going on is we're seeing that Christians are not so concerned about philosophy. They're not so concerned about philosophy in the 800s, in the 700s, but by the 1100s, the 1200s, and then it's off to the races. Right? So that's really what we're talking about. And Professor Clanton will give you a little more about the Christian side, because for our purposes as a Christian institution, in a Christian context, which the West is largely a Christian context, it's sometimes hard to see the Muslim background of what we do. But these three paths, the path of rejection of philosophy helping religion, and of the mystical tradition, these three paths, for our purposes, in our history, have a Muslim, an Islamic antecedent. Doesn't mean we're Muslims, it simply means that our history is more complex than you may have been. Hope this helps. Bye-bye now.